we've got Dr. Anna Paltseva. She is a soil scientist from UL. So she's coming over from Lafayette today to talk about managing contaminated soils and some of the implications for that in the landscape. So without further ado.
Everyone. Can you hear me well?
Yeah.
Okay. It's a pleasure to be in New Orleans with you. It's one of my favorite places in the US, and I'm happy to share with you some of the research findings that I've done in New York City, where I did my doctorate degree, and also in Louisiana, where I lived for the last 3 years. So in this presentation, we will emerge into urban soil science. We will look into some basic properties of soil science. Any one of you took soil science classes before or attended some workshops? Okay, quite a few. So for some of you, it will be a review. And we'll talk about specifically contamination, lead contamination. Lead is one of the major contaminants in the soils in urban environments, and especially in New Orleans. So we'll emphasize this metal. Then we go into plant contamination. We'll talk about vegetable contamination. Some of you maybe work in gardens, vegetable gardens. So we will talk about plant contamination and vegetables. And we'll talk, of course, how we remediate these contaminated landscapes, if it's a vegetable garden or maybe a park. And I will share with you some of educational resources so you can learn more. Soils are more than dirt. What is the difference between soil and dirt? Very often people change one word for another. What do you think is the same? No, why not?
Soil is alive.
Good. What makes it alive?
Microorganisms.
Yes, wonderful. So indeed it has organisms, lots of organisms. Actually, soil has an example, a handful of soil has more organisms than people on our planet. There's so many of them that are microscopic, we don't even see them. You can see this image on the microscope that a lot of microorganisms, fungi, protozoa, bacteria, tiny insects, they all live in different scales. We can identify them. And soil takes a very long time to form. It depends where we are, in Louisiana or Alaska or somewhere in Chicago, we'll have different soil formation rates. On average, it's about 1 centimeter per 100 years or under an inch for about 500 years. So this really ranges depending on some soil formation factors like climate, materials, topography, biology, of course, and time. Soil provides nutrients that required for plant growth. So it's so important for us to understand what's in the soil in order to grow really great plants and vegetables. And what is also interesting about soil, if you ever dig down, you will see different layers. We call them horizons. Any one of you dug a few feet down in the soil? Okay, you've probably seen some differences, different colors, textures. So soil texture is number one property that you should identify when working with soil. It's like home address. It's a must to know. And soil profiles, we'll go a little bit detail in a few slides, but these are really cool contrasting soil profiles in different regions. The bottom one is baby soil, I like to say, because it's only 10,000 years old, compared to the one on top about 2 million years old. The bottom profile is actually an image from New York City, and 10,000 years ago, or a little bit more, there was an ice age, and the soil was really full of sand from the remnants of that ice age when it retrieved. So the soils are very young because those are deposits from the glacier time. While soil on top is from Brazil, and they've been weathered for a very long time, and you barely see any horizons. The soil is already not very fertile, and unless they add fertilizer to it, it wouldn't be possible to create really good crops and agriculture. So, what is soil? Probably you've seen this in your soil classes before, but we'll review that soil consists of pores filled of water and air, about 25% each on average, depending on where we are. And most of the soil will be consist about 45% of minerals and 5% for organic matter. And this organic matter can be dead or very dead, or maybe alive, like plant roots. So plant roots, animals, maybe some insects, bacteria who live there. Then we have decaying material, and we have very dead, something that's already broken down and cannot break down any further. And you may see, maybe in your compost, it will be a very vivid example. It's already dead, it's decaying, so that we call it dead. And very dead is the very last particles that you see when compost is ready. It's dark in color, so it's recalcitrant material that does not decompose any longer and can stay so for up to 1,000 years. Why is soil important? Actually, I want to ask you this question. Why do we care about soil? Why do we need to know it?
Because it would sustain growth of our plants.
So plants, what else? I hear some whisper, but
Plus the substrate has nutrients in it.
good.
You know, it's where everything begins.
Good.
The top 4 inches separate us from starvation.
So food, plant, nutrients. Absolutely, absolutely, yes. So hydrological cycle, what other cycles are related to it? Nutrients, nitrogen, so there's some atmosphere, right? It's atmosphere regulator.
Decomposition.
Decomposition, right? So there's a lot of cycle, lots of practices taking place in the soil. And as you said, it's habitat for organisms, provides nutrition for plants. It's a purifying system for our water, and it's a modifier for the atmosphere. There is a constantly exchange of gases between our topsoil and the air. You all heard about carbon dioxide, right? So it's a big one that goes in and out of the soil. And methane, you see a lot of in some flooded areas in Louisiana. And of course, it's engineering medium. We build on top of soil, and very important for us to understand what's in the soil. Back in New York, when I used to do my doctorate there, people would ask me in Manhattan, so what do you do? I said, I'm a soil scientist. And they were like, look around, there's no soil. And I found it very funny because buildings are built on top of the soil. Just because we don't see them doesn't mean they're there. And very often you can see me on streets in New Orleans or any other big city when there is a construction. I love to take a look what's in that construction pit, because it tells you, it actually shows you what is the native soil. And it's really interesting to see this intricate web of pipes and wires in the soil. And again, it's really important for those engineers, civil engineers and architects, to understand what type of soil, even to build the infrastructure in. So soil is important for many different applications. And here's one of my favorite images to show this concept that urban soils are quite invisible sometimes, but they're underneath. So this urban soil can be defined and differentiated from other soils by limited resource, because there's not much of urban soil that is exposed. So we call it limited soil resource. We find a lot of artifacts in the soil. Artifacts could be from broken ceramic of Egyptian time to microplastic that we find nowadays. We also have modified temperatures. It's when in the biggest city, maybe in New Orleans, you can actually see like in suburbs versus French Quarter would have different temperatures. Like in French Quarter, you have a very hot, and especially in summer, and when you get to suburb, it's cooler in the atmosphere, but also soil will reflect these differences in the air. And finally, high heterogeneity. What does it mean? Soils are very heterogeneous. Especially in urban environments, because of human impact of different activities, from construction to gardening to factories, we will see different soil properties. And that's why it's so important for us to have a frequent sampling in your landscape, in the park or in the garden, to get a better results of what's in the soil, because you never know what was there before unless you do. And I encourage you to understand the management practices that were done by owners of the house or property, especially in the 20th century or early, because you don't know what can be buried there. But I want to ask you also, can you guess what city this is? It's a trick question.
Morocco.
Ooh, Morocco, what else? Madrid. You're the right region. Yes.
Barcelona.
Barcelona.
Spain.
Neighbors, yes, absolutely.
Oh, Naples, look at that. Yes, no one ever gets it right. Good, it is. So all of them are, but you're not wrong, right? This is great, because those cities do look alike, and those cities will have similar traces. And if you understand the concept in those big cities, you can apply this concept to other cities of similar history. And indeed, this happens to be Naples. Interestingly, Naples for centuries was not allowed to be built wide, and they had to build only vertically. So they found a lot of strata of old cities underneath inner Naples. Only later they were allowed to expand beyond the original walls and build. So we can see actually beyond this old city, there are some green areas and taller buildings. And this is reality for many old cities. That's why you keep calling names of those cities, because in the inner cities there was a lot of concrete, lots of buildings, and not many trees. And we get those trees only in when you get close to suburbs. And of course, the urban properties will be, so the soil will be different in these zones. When we look into the profile itself, when we dig down, and it depends where we are, sometimes we can dig a human height, like up to 6 feet down. This is what soil scientists typically do. If they want to study soil, they do 6 feet. Sometimes if you hit a rock or a water table, you can only do a couple feet or even less. But ideally, you would find this following horizons of soil layers. Not all of them will be present in one soil profile. Some of them can be missing, some of them can be even differentiated into sub-horizons. So the soil is very complex. But this is the ideal profile, which I want you to keep in mind next time you work in a soil profile. So it starts with all horizon, the top layer, that enrich in organic matter. It might be present, maybe not, depending on the influx of organic matter, like leaves, or maybe crops, or maybe dead animals. And it's typically characterized by dark color, black or brown. Then we go to a horizon. It's a topsoil. Typically, as landscapers or gardeners, you work with the topsoil, and you will find lots of mineral content with the organic matter. So more or less, it's dark in color if it has lots of organic matter. Then it's E horizon, horizon of elevation. This area is typically, this layer is typically light in color because it's losing nutrients to the B horizon, elevation, where these nutrients are accumulated. So B horizon would be E and B horizon considered as a subsoil, and it would get dark color. And then C horizon is practically broken pieces of rocks, of mineral soil, not much of organic matter at that point because it's a deep bore root system. And then R is a bedrock, it's unaltered material. So this is the ideal concept of a soil profile. Any one of you could describe what kind of soil you work with? Okay. Does it change with depths? Do you see some differences?
We have some sandy areas, very loam in some areas.
Good. So you can see some differences, some areas you don't see. Right. So this is some of the soils from New York City. So I'll show you some New York and Louisiana samples, and I like them because they really show representation of heterogeneity. And this isn't only one city. And why is that? Well, one is geology, and two is the human activities. So the top three, what I like to call as natural soils. This one is soil formed in sandy glacial fluvial deposits. So it's basically when glacier melted, it released some water, and this water deposited sandbit together with this. You can see very rich organic layer on top. Probably would be good for gardening. Then there is another one. It's eolene deposits, lacustrine deposits. It's from by wind and lake deposits. And this one at the bottom left, it's also eolene deposit, to me sediment brought by the wind over till unsorted material. And even these three examples are quite different. You can even see some visual differences in color, but also implication for soil texture differences. But this is my favorite anthropogenic soils. The top one is a coal ash deposit in Staten Island. Staten Island is one of the boroughs of New York that is infamous for one of the biggest landfill in the US. Now it's restored, some of them at least restored, but if you dig down, you will see this greenish color. That's how soil actually looks like because of the coal deposit. There's another one, it's a brown color, so you can see some layers, but they're not horizons. They are layers of dredged materials that come from the Hudson River. So for ships to go upstream, they need to dredge sometimes the Hudson, and then what do they do with the sediment? They dump it to Floyd Benefield in this area in Brooklyn, and it creates a new soil. And this on the right, I even have a print of this image in my office at ULL. It's a landfill. It's a dream for soil scientists to go to a landfill and dig there. What you can find, right, and how soil forms in these very unfavorable conditions. And yeah, so this is the construction landfill in the Bronx, New York. Another example of a Mexico City. Once upon a time, I was in Mexico City in a conference. Don't ask me anything about the tourist attractions. I can tell you all about the water treatment facilities. That's all I saw. And they took us to the creek where they showed us lots of illegal sewage flows. And you can imagine the aroma and the color of the creek. And then we went down, and they also showed us this outcrop that is exposing illegal garbage flow, because people just throw the garbage into the creek and then it accumulates. And after rain, it washes off, and this becomes our reality, and reality of many big cities around the world. This is just a couple examples. So what are some basic soil properties that we should understand when we will study or work with soils? And you probably know that. It's a pH, and soil structure, and soil texture, you mentioned that, salinity of the soil, infiltration, percolation of the water through the soil, nutrient content, aeration, organic matter, and heavy metals. Any one of you ever tested soil? In a lab or by yourself? Just a few of you? Okay. What do you typically test for?
pH, alkalinity, nutrients.
Structure, good. Has anyone ever tested heavy metals? One. Why you don't test for heavy metals? I'm curious.
A lot of times it costs extra.
Yes.
Good, no, that's good. It's extra. What else? What other reasons?
Does it matter if you're not growing food?
Good. It does. If you work with that soil, right? You need to be protective yourself. So we'll talk about the potential exposure. What else?
What exact heavy metals are the farm?
Good. Heavy metals, toxic elements like lead, cadmium, arsenic, maybe mercury, copper, zinc could be as well. Mostly lead and arsenic that would be of concern, the most common ones.
I didn't even think about it, to be honest with you.
We don't
Good.
have it as much anymore.
Huh?
Yeah, we don't have as much of it, not as prevalent as it once was.
Okay, good. Okay, so now we will talk through and give some solutions to the cost and to a little to know more about these metals and which metals are there, and talk about if they still exist or not in the environment and why we should know. So one thing I want you to know is you can use this really cool app. You can use it with your smartphone, and you can use your smartphones throughout my presentation a few times. But there's a QR code if you would like to download the Soil web app, or just make a note of it. It's a really cool app for you to use on your smartphones. It's for free to understand what's in your soil. Without doing soil test results, you can get your data. If you ask to get my data, and it will pull up soil profiles where you are, or you can put specific address. You can also open this soil web. You can just look up online. It will open you on the browser and the website, and you can download reports on any location in the United States, which is really cool because you can use those official reports created by USDA, Department of Agriculture, and use them for clients, especially if you need to persuade them to do something and they don't always want to listen to you. But you can click, look, this is what USDA did. This is the map of the soil quality that we have on your property. This is why we should do X, Y, Z. So it's a really great resource for you to back up your plans that you have for your clients. So now let's talk a little bit more about heavy metals. Common issues in urban soils you probably encounter as a landscaper. It's soil compaction, maybe soil sealing, soil erosion, climate change affects all these properties. And as we see with wildfires or extreme floods or drought or storms, it affects our turfs and our landscapes in general. Contamination is still a big issue, and we're going to dive in. Some heavy metals, common heavy metals, I already mentioned to you. That's arsenic, cadmium, chromium, copper, mercury, nickel, lead, thallium, and zinc. There are of course more pollutants, organic pollutants, but for the sake of this presentation, we'll just focus on one, lead. You can see that many of these metals come from different sources, some of them industry, some of them from fertilizers, some of them from traffic or coal combustion, insecticides, pesticides. Lead is still prevalent, although it's historical use. We no longer add lead into gasoline or paint. Do you remember when it was banned?
1978.
Great, 1978, when lead was banned to enter the paint or gasoline, but the legacy is still there. It didn't go anywhere, it stays. Lead is quite mobile, it doesn't really leach. Arsenic can leach, but not lead, so it stays in the soil unless you do something to this, and I'm going to show you what you can do to modify concentration. The other source is historical use of pesticides. It's also a thing. In the past, they used to add lead, arsenic pesticides in orchards, and this lead and arsenic stays there. One of my research projects was in New Jersey, in a big farm, when they documented adding this lead arsenic, and then our research team had to remediate this spot, and I will tell you what our results were. Any one of you have children? Quite a few. So here's a little bit depressing, but I promise it will get better. 1 out of 3 children are poisoned by lead in the world. And soil is one of the sources of this pollution. Lead can come from many different sources. In other countries, they don't have EPA who controlled it, and they still use like lead in mining gold, or they still use them in paint, or they use it in dyes or pigments or paints for traditional pottery. But in our case, we really emphasize soil as one of the major sources that's still out there. Lead is a neurotoxin. It affects cognitive development of children. It can cause their cognitive development slow down. It can reduce IQ and have some physical impairments. There are still lots of children, even in the US, who were exposed to lead because it's very hard to test all the environment, and very often it's the only agencies only test for walls or windows or houses, but do not test gardens or backyards of children. And this is why it's really great that you're here, because you can take that extra responsibility and offer your clients a test for contaminants and see what's in their backyards. So how does this contaminant get into our human body? There are different sources, different ways. One is through uptake of vegetables. If vegetables are grown in contaminated soil and we consume it, then over time they can accumulate in our bodies. Another one is through direct exposure. In ingestion, actually, especially of children, we're talking mostly here about children because they're most susceptible to contamination. For them, for children to get lead poison is enough to be exposed to lead of this much. At the top of this pan, it's how much they need the lead paint to be poisoned. Children are much smaller than us, they are still developing, so they don't have a good immune system to resist it. So that's why when children ingest soil, playing in the playground or in the garden with lead, they can be exposed. And house dust as well can be a problem. Inhalation and dermal contract, mostly inhalation from outside, again, dust or something in the air, especially if it's areas where it's close to factories. We all probably heard of Cancer Alley here, right? So it's a good example of what inhalation problem could be. Dermal contact is more rare. It's when professionals typically work in the fields and maybe they didn't have the protective gear, or maybe someone works in the factories or like in the industry or in the labs, they can get exposed to those pollutants. And the third one is leaching to groundwater, and drinking of the groundwater is polluted. I don't know about New Orleans, but I know Lafayette, arsenic is a problem in water, and arsenic is naturally consists in a lot of Mississippi sediment that comes from upstream. So we found a lot of arsenic in Lafayette. This is an example of what contamination might look like, and I remember I told you it's also heterogeneous, so we don't find like well-distributed contamination levels around the cities. We find them a lot in inner cities, in older part of the cities. This is just an example of New York, but there are other cities that have the same outline. Dr. Gilkey, who spent 33 years here in New Orleans and recently retired from Tulane University, studied these soil contamination issues for 3 decades, and he correlated them with blood lead level of children, and found that soil is one of the major contributors to elevated blood lead level in children of New Orleans. And what we see here again, the inner city, the oldest part of the city, contaminated. And as someone mentioned earlier, it's not a problem anymore. It's decreased, but it's still a problem. So we have, you can see clear decrease between 2001, and then he did the second survey 2017, before Katrina, after Katrina, and we can see decline of lead in the soil and decline of blood lead level in children with 2005 and then 2015, which is great news. We are definitely doing a big progress with the decrease of metals in the environment in children, but it's still there. And it's important for us to understand what we have. One of my research, one of the projects is actually studying contaminants in Lafayette. So there is no map of Lafayette like the one for New Orleans. So Dr. Milke is one of our advisors. We'll try to understand what we have in the city that is not as big or doesn't have as much industrial impact as New Orleans or even Baton Rouge. And we still find some areas in downtown or northern part of Lafayette that are older. Also, they have more African American communities. And we also find it's lead very often found in those communities. And so it's it's environmental injustice. And so there is more to lead contamination than exposure to children, but also who lives in those areas. What also interesting is that sometimes we ask to study specific lots and we analyze metals from a block, for example. What we find here is different metals, metal concentrations. It might be hard for you to see, but all these numbers is from one small block and they have different concentrations. What does it mean? It means that if you want to plant a garden, you really need to sample in several locations in that particular garden to understand where the hotspot might be. Because if you just collect one representative sample and send it to the lab, you will get an average for this plot, but you may not identify a hotspot, which we can do. So one of the takeaways from this presentation, I want you to remember that soil is heterogeneous and it's better to get frequent sampling when it comes to metals. Something else to know is this is the slide from my colleagues from Columbia University who studied private yards versus public areas in one area in New York, Greenpoint. And what they found is that private samples had much higher concentrations of lead compared to public samples. So if you work in private yards, in the backyards, someone's property, be aware that potentially they may be more contaminated than parks. And why is that? Well, in parks, there's more remediation happening. There might be lawn that's planted, maybe compost that's constantly added. And in private yard, people may not do anything. Or this yard been like this for ages, or owners died, and the house stayed like that. So, or new owners didn't know anything about it. So lots of issues can be associated with the private gardening, private backyards, and something for you to remember. So what about vegetables and plant contamination? I was really surprised when I came to New York. I am originally from Russia and we grow vegetables as part of our culture. And when I came to New York, I couldn't understand why people garden in the middle of the city. They have food in stores, there's abundance, and why do they grow tomatoes and potatoes? They're busy people. I didn't realize there are really great benefits to urban gardening once I started digging into research. So can you tell me what are the benefits of urban gardening?
You know where your food's coming from.
Good.
Cheaper.
Good.
Educational value.
Yes. Excellent. So it's way more than just food that I always associated gardening with. It's indeed it's nutritious food, grocery reduction, its health benefits. It even minimizes criminal activities because people have something to do and they have less likely to hurt their neighbors that they work with. And a deeper connection to agriculture and nature. This urban contamination issue is not just urban problem, it's also suburban. If we feel that we have around cities in the past had some addition of pesticides or insecticides containing metals, they most likely are still there. Some of them may be washed away or leached down, but still a high proportion of it will be in the soil, especially when it comes to lead, because again, it's not very mobile. So I mentioned in New Jersey farm, we did this test in a suburban Duke farm in New Jersey, really beautiful big farm. They used to excavate contaminated soil, and they knew about the problem of contamination and just dumped the soil in another part of the field. But then they cannot do it forever. So they asked our team at Brooklyn College to come and do some remediation. And we applied different fertilizers and different composts. Fertilizers mostly consist of phosphorus at different rates, and we also added some iron and manganese fertilizers that will enhance stabilization of lead to make it less toxic. And we added different rates of compost and raised bed soil. So what we found? We found the plants that we grew, like tomatoes, spinach, actually lettuce, carrots, and radishes, they all had different response to this amendment. And they had different ways how they would take in metals. Very often we think of vegetables, especially for root vegetables, they probably take it from the bottom, right? They just suck it in and they get a carrot full of lead. True for lead, true for carrots, but may not be true for other root vegetables, because for some of them it's actually uptaking or rather depositing these metals on the surface of the vegetable or on leaf surface. If there's splashes, if it's leafy greens or herbs, they get splashes from surrounding areas. It doesn't come from the roots. And the carrot is an interesting vegetable because it can actually uptake from the core. Like when you cut the carrot in half, you see typically a core inside, right? So that's a second mechanism for metals. It doesn't help to peel it. It reduces metals, but peeling is only partially reduce contamination. Big part will come from the uptake. But other vegetables like potatoes, for example, or onions, you can peel and it will have a significant reduction in metals. Tomatoes were interesting, and also eggplants we planted. It's because they grew far from the soil, they're tall plants, they don't get splashes from surrounding areas, so it's one protective mechanism. And two, fruit vegetables, they actually have barriers inside of them. They do not allow for metals to go into the plant. Like leafy greens or root vegetables, they have very weak barriers inside of those plants. So you can grow vegetables in a medium or like moderately contaminated soil, but if those vegetables are fruit vegetables, something that will grow far from the soil, soil surface like tomatoes or eggplants or a squash, and they will be able to produce really healthy vegetables. What we also found is that the leafy greens and herbs and root vegetables had the most concentration of metals, followed by leafy greens and tomatoes or like fruit vegetables. So amendments did not have as much impact on the lead or arsenic contamination in our vegetables. What was really impactful is the plant type itself. So again, root vegetables or leafy greens, they have very weak barriers, and leafy greens, herbs can get splashes from surrounding areas, while tomatoes were tall plants with a strong physiological barriers inside to prevent contamination going into the fruits. So that's why you choose fruits over roots. And then remediation. What can you do? You're probably depressed by now, and you're all wondering where your vegetables are coming from and what you have in your soil. Well, I have some solutions for you, don't worry. So these are just a couple of interesting images I want to spark how much you are empowered to change the landscape. This is a park in Mexico City. It's beautiful, right? Like a really pretty area. You would never guess that in the past, it used to be oil refinery with 30-meter depths of oil.
Wow.
And there is one part where you can take a picture of this just to show what it's there, what it used to be there. They remediated it it was, of course, scientists working, landscaper, professionals, and government who gave the money to they used bacteria to feed on this oil to remediate it and then plant this beautiful park. And now, of course, dogs are not allowed to play around, so there's no one dig in, but otherwise it's pretty safe to have a picnic on the surface. So what I want to tell you with this is that we have a power to remediate our environment even if it's polluted. So how would you do it on the landscape scale? There are many different ways, and one of them is the simplest way is to do composting. So one of the results of our research in New Jersey, they showed you before, they did another research project in Brooklyn, we found that compost were the most efficient way to remediate soil against lead and building raised beds. So the compost in New Orleans, for example, we actually have lots of different composting locations where it is available for people. In New Orleans, we have one composting facility, in Baton Rouge, probably few options. But otherwise, you can compost yourself or buy it. But there are some areas where you can get compost for free. Garden design matters, and make sure you avoid using treated wood, and you will cover soil or use mulch. As an example, in Chicago, beautiful area, they use the straw mulch and lots of compost around the the vegetable garden. Use a raised bed soil if you know the soil is contaminated. So you don't have to amend it if you can build a raised bed, but it's really important to put a landscape fabric underneath or geotextile, and then put clean soil on top and make some compost if the soil is needs some nutrients. This way you will protect your roots going into polluted soil. Of course, it has a limitation because you may have to maintain this raised bed over years. It depends, maybe I don't know how many years it will last, 5, 10 years. So over time you will need to change it. Where would you get the clean soil? In New York, for example, there is an interesting project. It's called New York City Soil Bank, where mayor's office collects soil from buildings, construction sites. When buildings are being built, in the past they would take it, this clean sediment, I mentioned you it was glacier before, so it's really glacier sediment and it's clean, pristine sand. In the past they would take it to Pennsylvania or upstate New York or Long Island, distribute it for different projects or maybe even landfill. But it's like, hey, this is a clean source, why don't you bring it back to community gardens or parks? And this is what they're doing now. They bring this clean sediment back to the communities and people can get it for free if they're a community organization. The only thing is that it's sand, not much of nutrients, right? So that's why compost, and they have a big project, New York City Compost, that gives again compost for free. So the community organizations can get that compost and mix with the soil bank sediment, make a nutritious soil. And we did the project, we found that the 33% of compost added to this sediment would be really good proportion, and the plants, vegetables grow amazingly. In New Orleans, Dr. Milky used Mississippi spillway soil or sediment, and I call it Louisiana clay soil bank, because according to USGS, it was about 16 parts per million of lead, which is very natural, low content of lead. So he used in his project to remediate soil in New Orleans. This is sediment from Mississippi, right outside of New Orleans. What other fruits or vegetables or products you can use? It's actually what we eat. This examples of what we can add to the soil, different coffee grounds and tea, and even seaweed and nuts and fruits and vegetables that we can chop and add to the soil or compost. It will also, what it does, it will dilute the concentration of metals. And when we add organic matter to the soil, we also create organomineral complexes. So we change the chemistry of metals. Metals don't go anywhere, but we dilute them and we change their toxicity. So we make them less toxic, less bioavailable for humans, because it will create a chelate, the organic molecule will hold down metal inside and not let it go. And so that's why adding organic matter in different forms is beneficial, in addition to all other benefits that you know adding organic matter to the soil. Anyone heard about biochar? Anyone use it? Okay. What about biosolids? Have you heard about biosolids? So really cool products. I highly encourage you to check out both. So biochar is combusted plant tissue, really like plant residues that are going under pyrolysis process, very high temperatures, low oxygen. So it sequesters carbon. It does not convert to carbon dioxide. And then we have biosolids. It's a processed sewage sludge, human waste in other ways. And there are different classes of these biosolids. Some of them they classify differently. You can read about that in the detail. They can be used for different purposes. But you can actually also use them in landscape practices. So biosolids full of nutrients. Both biochar biosolids can increase water holding capacity, sequester more carbon, bring nutrients to the soil, really have benefits as compost. The biosolid may although have some pollutants. That's why when you buy biosolid, you should read what class it belongs to and what it contains, so you choose the proper purpose for it. Compost may also contain sometimes metals. So you need to know what is the source of your compost and or maybe even test, like invest in one-time test for this vendor to check the product. Because the trees may contain metals like leaves of the trees or manure that they used. Sometimes I get a lot of amendments in the lab in Lafayette, and we see that it's not lead is proper, but mercury or cadmium, depending what they use to create those amendments. So it's really important to know where these amendments are coming from, organic or inorganic. Some companies will put it on their website, but not many of them do. Have you heard about sunflowers cleaning up soil? Anyone tried that? How did it work?
I haven't tried it.
It worked?
I mean, overall, I use a number of things. I have like a homestead garden in the house, and I use copper, and I also use sunflowers as well, just to help the soil and like yield and all that. I've seen it's only my first year with this garden, and it's humongous. It's the biggest one on my block.
Wow.
So.
Well, I would love to know how it goes. If you would like to test the soil, we'll share with you how you can test it. It's very low price.
He just said it was expensive. I don't know.
I will tell you, it's not that expensive. But sunflowers, using purely sunflowers to clean up soil is a myth. My colleagues did a review, paper review, critical review of a bunch of different literature sources and found that lead cannot be substantially extracted by sunflowers. It's not enough, and there is no plant that can actually extract lead efficiently from the soil. It doesn't meet all the criteria for it. There are some other hyperaccumulative plants that can take nickel or copper or manganese, but not lead. Or arsenic can be uptaken by them as well. So, sorry to disappoint you, but I don't want you to waste your time. But if you apply multiple practices, that might work.
I've been lied to.
No, it's a common thing, and we only published this paper 3 years ago, so it's so here's another way. You can again pull up your smartphones and use the QR code to download this article. If you'd like to read more about legacy contamination, I wrote this article a couple years ago, last year, and it summarizes what practices you can use to remediate soil, and also talks about metals in more detail. So in a nutshell, organic matter is important. Organic matter matters. So add compost, biosolids, biochar to create these organic mineral complexes with soil, and dilute the soil metal concentrations. Use liming if pH is low, like in Louisiana pH is generally low. You add calcium, magnesium to the soil, but also increasing pH. At neutral pH, metals are least available, so less tax. Use conservation tillage practices. Remember I told you that the splash can happen on the surface of the leafy greens, so you try to use a drip irrigation or put some straw or mulch to keep the splash down if the soil is contaminated. Placement, don't put garden closer than 50 meters from a traffic area. And also raised beds would be a great solution to growing vegetables. And the dust control, well, I already mentioned that mulch is a great option for it with drip irrigation. The downside of it that it's not a permanent solution, that the limitation is that we constantly need to monitor it and maybe replace our strategy with something else over the years. Raised beds will break down over the years, so you need to replace it. And compost degrades, so you need to also account for that. Add more if it needs to be. So what is the solution for testing? You can use it or make a note of the Delta Urban Soils Lab. It's our lab in ULL Lafayette. We offer at very low price metal, pH, organic matter, nutrient content, texture tests. And heavy metal is the number one that I would suggest you to do, because you can do other labs, test in other labs, but heavy metal is something that needs to be done at least one time for the area that you work with. It doesn't need to be tested like pH unless you do remediation over time to the soil. Then you want to see if your remediation works, so you need to test again for heavy metals. But But otherwise, if you at least test your property once, it will give you the result what is there. Because metals don't go anywhere, right? So, and it's $15 per sample. If you send us a whole bunch of samples, we can reduce the price. It's very, prices are based because it's a university, so we're not profit, we're not making money, it's only for operations. Some other sources for you to learn about metals and more research on related to urban soils is on my website, Paltseva.com. There is another QR code. I have a bunch of podcasts that participated in discussing these issues, and also there is a free guide on effective strategies for heavy metal. So it goes a little bit more detail how to work with this, and you can download it and distribute it to your clients if you need to. And there's more on YouTube. So I'm all about sharing research. My site is People Science. So I try to share my research with the public, but also my colleagues. And on the YouTube channel under Anna Paltseva, you can find lots of video lectures of my colleagues from the US and abroad talking about urban soil issues and soils surveys and composting, lots of cool ideas for you to investigate. And I want you to become my friend on Instagram. If you have on Instagram, feel free to follow me. It's House of Soil. I also share in a very easy layperson language about soils and environment and what it's like to be a scientist. So feel free to follow me. And fresh off the bat, I very recently published an ebook about 17 pages that is Secret to Sustainable Management for Turf and Parks. It talks about strategies for turf management, for parks, for golf courses, in terms of nutrient management, water management, and plant contamination, or vegetable contamination, plant contamination, or soil contamination. So you can use another QR code to get your copy. So this is another great resource for you to have. And so I will be publishing a urban soil test guide that you can use to test soils on your own without a lab. Heavy metals is something you do need to have a lab for, although there are a couple of kits for soil lab out there. You might try them. But otherwise, there's really cool guide on how to test the soils on your own, and that will be very inexpensive because it's you doing it. So the key points of my presentation that testing is important. Soils in urban environments are very heterogeneous, and we need to account for it. So testing in multiple locations of one property should be prioritized. Some remediation options exist that are low cost and maybe even free if you use this local compost facilities, for example. Raised beds would be the most, or one of the most efficient ways to deal with contaminated soil. So, thank you for your attention. Here's my contact information. Feel free to contact me, connect with me, and check out the resources that are available to you. Thank you so much.
Are there any questions?
You got time for one question if anybody's got it. One question over here.
So I've heard that fungi-rich organic matter could help with contaminated soils. Does that apply to heavy metals or more so to other contaminants?
Yes, the research is there. They're still trying to figure it out how to do the best strategy for that. But the fungi indeed is bound to form a pyromorphic mineral, so it converts phosphorus, combines actually phosphorus and lead and make it a mineral form, which is really cool because pyromorphic is a non-toxic, not really available, bioavailable mineral. So yeah, if you find that, you can use it for phytoremediation. And something else we are testing is actually using dried mycelium to remediate lead in the University of Buffalo. So that research is ongoing, and maybe next time we meet, I will tell you all about it. But yes, fungi is super powerful. I will be around if you would like to ask me questions after the final presentation.
Thank you.